Johnny the Town Tamer by L. Ron Hubbard. At the moment in history when Johnny tackled Thorpeville, that squalid cluster of shacks and loading pens was the current end of the Texas Trail, whence came tens of thousands of heads of beef to be shipped to Kansas City, and tens of dozens of Texas punchers to be cheated, knocked out, poisoned, shot, and mayhemmed. Just now, Thorpeville sat in the middle of a sea of prairie mud, the spring rains being late here, and waited for the first of the long, bawling herds which would come and make the citizenry, namely George Bart, solvent once more. Cattle buyers waited in boredom around the New York house. Gamblers and their cohorts shuffled cards disconsolately. Dance halls had the desolate and deceptive air of churches. George Bart was all ready for the brisk trade which would last the next many months. As sole agent for more things than any respectable man would want, Bart had caused his warehouse, the only warehouse, to be full of cases and bottles which gurgled, barrels which sloshed, and kegs which purled, as well as more mundane articles such as canned corn, pineapple, peaches, tomatoes, and peas, as well as bulging sacks of dried beans and casks of brined beef. George was what might have been called a monopolist. He ran the New York house, the New York bar, the New York restaurant, and the Gilded Cage dance hall. He wholesaled anything he might have left over to the few smaller establishments and kept them from growing by the simple arithmetic of canceling out whatever owner seemed to challenge the main trade. A man of Bart's temperament and philosophy, which was that them as grabs gets, takes very unkindly to competition in any field. Therefore, he courted the best-looking girl, drove the best gig, wore the most expensive boots, and drank the most whiskey of anyone in town. His dislike of competition went so far as to hire only those marshals who could not shoot as good as George. Not, of course, that George did much shooting. There were several indefinite-eyed gents around the New York house who generally attended to the more sordid business details of the Bart empire. The railroad had been here for a long time. It had not gone any further because of certain Bart-like proceedings back in Wall Street. So Bart was a railhead, and Thorpeville, unless drivers wanted to trail another 250 miles, was the logical and inevitable destination of the Texas herds. George ran his kingdom and was entirely satisfied with it. Texans had to come into it and were just as intensely dissatisfied. But there was nothing they could do. They had to sell their cattle, and 250 miles in the drag is a long, long ways to ride. This morning, the prairie looked drier. The citizenry did not expect a herd today or for many days, a river still being in flood to the south. And they did not at first recognize the appearance of one lone Texan as the symbol that their season of rapine and robbery had begun. Johnny Austin Darrell, somewhat better known as Sudden Johnny, owner of the Double G down Matagordas Way, was thin and muddy in his saddle. But his gun was not muddy. He had stopped outside town and cleaned that weapon with great care and love, crooning the while in an off-key tenor that there would be blood on the barroom floor that night. His herd was 10 days' drive behind him because of a swollen river and because they'd need rail cars on arrival in Thorpeville. But ordering rail cars was not the reason Sudden Johnny had come north, nor why he had ridden in advance. There were plenty of things on the Double G to demand the owner's attention, and he had 5 men, any one of whom would have made an entirely competent trail boss. Well, not entirely competent. Greg Matson had brought the herd last year, which was why Sudden Johnny was here. He rode to the middle of the main and only street.
"Son,"
said Johnny to a man about 80 years old sitting on a porch.
"could you kindly direct me to the person, this here George Bart?"
"Son,"
cried the oldster.
"looky here."
"Can it, Pop?"
said George Bart. He had a nose for business, and anybody with a squint could read Texas on Sudden Johnny.
"Howdy, cowboy. Get down and come in."
Sudden Johnny looked over his prey. George Bart was about 6'6". He carried a sawed-off shotgun in a holster, wore a big diamond in his tie, and he had a look on his face which might have fooled a foolish fly, but not another tarantula.
"You Bart?"
"I'm Bart."
Bart read what he could of the mount's brand through the mud, then looked at Johnny. Some indefinable warning went through the monopolist, a faculty he had which accounted for his living so long.
"Come in and have a drink."
Johnny was looking up and down the street and sizing the town. This man probably had hired guns and friends behind every counter. He looked back at Bart. Northerners had funny ideas about shooting, even skunks. This, then, was what George Matson had faced. He had received payment for 2,000 longhorns, had distributed spending money to his men, and shortly afterward awakened in the road, slug-happy and flat broke. The Double G had had to creep mighty easy through the past winter without that cash. Greg recalled being invited into a game in a back room and no more. Somebody in Thorpeville owed Sudden Johnny $15,000, and that somebody was probably George Bart.
"Your outfit coming?"
Yeah, the river's up. Don't you ever get spring up here?"
"It'll go back in a few days. Come ahead to order cars?"
"Yeah. Where's the rail agent?"
"Over in that shack. When you get through, come back and have a drink. You must be pretty thirsty."
"I'm thirsty, all right. Hungry, too."
He went down the steps and across the street to the indicated shack. When he came out, he found that they had stabled his horse for him. He went into the New York bar and found Bart.
"Give him the best."
Bart told the bartender. Johnny poured a careful glass. He was known somewhat as a drinking man down Matagordas. It was said he could hold more liquor than anybody in that end of Texas, but this, of course, was a considerable exaggeration, for Johnny almost never got drunk. He had 3 to start his circulation going and then insisted on paying for them.
"No, no. Hell no. Glad to have you come here. Don't worry none."
Johnny took out a poke.
"Well, maybe you wouldn't accept gold dust anyway. It's all the hard money I got."
"Gold dust?"
said Bart, looking at the long poke.
"Where'd that come from? I ain't never seen any from your part of the country."
"Ain't. It's from Mexico. We ship down a lot of stuff by boat, and they paid us in this stuff. Yucatan, most likely. People generally will take it, though. It's worth about $17 an ounce."
Bart looked at the bright flakes, and his eyes heated a trifle.
"Let's see some closer."
Johnny put a dab of the stuff in the outstretched palm, and Bart picked it over, glancing now and then at the tall poke of it.
"You must have plenty in that sack. How much you think?"
$5,000, $6,000, that's all."
Bart shivered and put the subject aside for the moment with some effort. It was an obvious strain.
"Well, wouldn't have been able to have made my drive if the Mexes hadn't paid out. Come through just in time. Well, here's mud in your eye."
He drank again with a quick jerk of his wrist and put the poke back, evidently forgetting the tiny amount he had given Bart.
Here, cowboy. I sure don't want to be considered dishonest. I invited you to drink up, and I meant it. This here's your gold.
Oh, yeah, so it is,
said Johnny, taking it back into the poke, which he again put away. Johnny was looking the place over. When you are getting ready to tear things apart, board by board, it's a good thing to get a careful idea of how they go together. This was one big room with a bar and tables in it, with windows on the opposite wall from the bar. A big double door at the back was open to daylight, and beyond it lay what seemed to be Bart's warehouse. 2 slanted doors went down a flight of steps. This was a sod house below ground level, cool and comfortable. A cook was struggling up the steps with a box of sardines under one arm and a keg of wine under the other. When he reached the top, he shut the doors and snapped a padlock into place. Johnny nodded to himself, shifted his gun belt, and felt of his stubbly jaw.
Yeah, reckon I'll shave me up a trifle. I ain't riding back. Too blame comfortable here.
Sure. We'll have her fixed right up for you. Ain't a bed bug in the place. Joe, show Mr. You didn't say your name.
They call me Johnny.
Joe, show Mr. Johnny out a room and let the Chinese lug him up a bath.
He smiled upon Johnny.
When you come down, maybe we can have a little excitement, like a game of cards. It sure is dull hereabouts.
Yeah, suits me. But all I got is gold dust.
Reckon I won't quibble none about that, seeing you probably got 2,000-3,000 cattle in a trail herd down here as well. Pete already took in your war sack when he cared for your hoss.
Much obliged.
It was afternoon when he came down. He had had a sleep and grub, and he felt up to his game. Johnny had his campaign pretty well mapped. He'd spent a long time mapping it. The only time he'd ever go sudden was when action began. George Bart had fixed up a back room very tastefully with a large array of bottles on a sideboard, a quantity of edibles, and a table on which lay a new deck of cards, and around which sat, waiting very patiently, men who would have stayed there day and night for a week if Bart had told them to. Johnny walked in and found a very smiling and hospitable George.
Well, we was hoping you'd be down, Mr. Johnny. A few boys like yourself drifted in. We was about to have a game. Have something to drink first?
They drank. Then George pulled back a chair. Johnny was expected to get into that chair, but it had its back to the door. Johnny took another which suited him better and Bart less. Johnny picked up the cards, broke their seal, and shuffled them. He gave a quick look around the table and saw nothing but hard, gaunt faces about as full of expression as a sidewinder's. Johnny grinned at them companionably. The door of the outer saloon opened, and a man came in. A big man, even as Texans go. He wore mainly buckskin, about 3 or 4 deers' worth of it, stained with mud and grease. He had a beard, a black beard, thick enough to be bulletproof. If, from where he sat, sudden Johnny shot this newcomer any glance, none noticed, so intent were they on getting their first cards. Johnny had delayed. Spanish Mike McCarty was something more than Johnny's top rider. He was also Johnny's friend. Johnny's height and slenderness and his movements had grace, but Mike's chief attribute was a mountainous strength which sometimes fell on men and cured them of things, including living. Spanish Mike combed some of the mud out of his beard, ordered a beer mug of whiskey, scooped up 1 handful of pretzels, 1 pound, from the free lunch and composed himself at the bar. He, too, had paused on the edge of town, but not to clean his gun. He had halted to separate his arrival from Johnny's by several unsuspicious hours, and had profited by a nice, relaxing snooze in the mud. Mike looked over the premises, looked out through the back door, sighed in pure delight, and relaxed to watch the game. Sudden Johnny dealt to a somewhat dumbfounded crowd. He had been clumsy enough when he shuffled the cards, but somehow these cards weren't the cards which had been carefully rewrapped and placed in the center of the table. They were honest cards, and there were glowers of wonder at George Bart at this supposed oversight.
I plumb forgot about money. This poker is all I brought, and this kind of makes it look like I'm playing on credit.
He hitched at the poke in his back pocket.
Now, don't you fret about money. I'm sure you can cover your loss. Besides, there's your trail herd.
So there is,
said Johnny, and picked up his hand. They played for a round before Johnny discovered abruptly that he was using a new deck. He found he was using it because it didn't have creases on the aces where he had put them. He lost promptly, stud being a quick game, but one deal later, being Johnny's, found them playing with another new deck. Bart's abrupt shift from returned confidence to new alarm registered the shift. Johnny did not win very much, but the deck stayed in for 5 deals until the bartender accidentally placed his tray on the momentary idle cards. Johnny was playing with Bart's deck once more. The whiskey kept coming, and Johnny's chips kept going down. At last he gave Mike a private wink. Mike instantly drained off the remainder of his whiskey, crammed down the rest of his free lunch, and stood a little straighter at the bar, 20 feet away.
Well, reckon I'll have to cash in for tonight, boys. It's been a long day.
Well, I hate to break up a good game.
I'll tell you what. I'll cut you double or quits.
Well, now, Mr. Johnny, I couldn't do that. I reckon the best thing is just cash you in.
Johnny shrugged. He reached back for the poke and then managed to look most terribly astonished and mad. It was gone. The bartender.
My gold. I had it when I sat down here. I guess I'll have to go back.
Well, now, Mr. Johnny, don't let that worry you. Seeing that them blue chips was worth exactly 1,000 apiece, I can always take a trail herd.
1,000.
Why, you didn't ask, and I thought that you...
Johnny smiled. He pulled 3 packs of cards out of his lap and dropped them on the board.
I reckon then you'd maybe like to explain something else you forgot to mention. George, these here cards you use just plain read too easy.
You accusing me of card cheating?
Why, no. I meant to call you a dirty lying card cheat.
With a crash, the kerosene light went out. The fragments and bits of flame splattered. Spanish Mike fired 3 more shots and put the main barroom in darkness. The table came up like a battering ram and slammed George into the wall. Johnny's gun blazed and Bart's man Tolliver curled into himself with a groan. 3 guns racketed at the spot where Johnny had been, but Johnny wasn't there.
Yeah! Oh!
Yelled to Spanish Mike.
Yowie!
Screamed Spanish Mike.
They're out the back,
bawled Bart, and hurriedly thundered after them. Sudden Johnny had his second line to fall back upon when his first one buckled. He and Mike went at the warehouse flaps in a dive, and Mike's big fist wrenched off the lock. They plummeted down the steps and whirled to slam the doors back upon them. An instant later, a body hid Wood outside, and somebody bawled for them to come out. Johnny shot cunningly by feel, and there was a yelp of anguish immediately after. By the flash of the shot, Mike found the inner bar and placed it across. The doors strained up, and Johnny fired again. Their assailants shot a dozen times into the door and tried to pry it open at a distance using rails. Mike grunted with busyness. He was loading up the stairs with assorted crates and barrels, and so great was his strength, and so rapidly did he work, that the next shots fired from outside went into wood and tin. This big below-ground warehouse had been built long ago, and it had been built well. It had served as defense against Indians and cyclones, and its thick sod walls were glued together by grass roots and many rains. Johnny inspected loopholes, found one which commanded the back of the New York bar, and gave them 6 shots as fast as he could fan. That instantly ended the attack. Mike mopped his brow.
Well, Johnny, here we be. And here it appears we're going to be staying for some time to come. If you got no great objections, that keg I seen by your own gun flashes must contain some high wine.
They found it. They broached it. Big Spanish Mike lay down on his back, held up the keg like it was a bottle, and had himself a good long drink. A half-gallon.
Thin stuff. Never much cared for wine.
He put it down and went feeling through the interior over a fortune in liquors and food. A loud pop startled him.
What's that?
That is champagne.
Spanish Mike listened to the gurgle with a grin. By midnight, George Bart had snarled and sweated himself into a fine fury. They had pried the door half off before they discovered that the passageway was blocked, beyond their ability to open it from the outside, and they had lost and wounded 3 men, all of whom damned George heartily with what breath they could muster.
Condemned Texans!
Snarled Tolliver, gray with a chip gone off her rib.
I told you we ought to think twice before ringing that gin around.
You never said no such thing,
said Dutch stolidly.
All you said was you wanted $100 instead of 50.
Do you mean to tell me,
said Bart to his assembled 5,
that you won't charge that door again?
You know dang well we won't.
Gritted Tolliver.
Wait afore morning, I says, then blow 'em skywide and handsome with blasting powder.
They looked on this with favor, and arranging a watch amongst them, excluding Tolliver, the one wounded man who was still with them, they retired from the field for the night. In the morning, the meadowlarks were singing brightly. The prairie was blooming, but very, very wet, and a freighter came in from Hunter for supplies. His storekeeper routed George Bart from a nightmare.
Freighter down there with a big order. I can't feel half of it from the shelves.
Get it from the warehouse.
Then he suddenly remembered. He hastily got on his clothes and went down to see the store.
I can't wait, Mr. Bart,
said the freighter.
We was held up plenty by the rains, and we nigh out of grub. I need more than Lem here can give me, but if that's all, why, that's the best I can do. I got to get back. Men's is hungry.
Bart looked at the stripped shelves and then at the pile of money. The freighter was about to leave.
Wait, we had, well, a little accident. But I think maybe I can get something up by 2 o'clock if you'll just wait around.
The freighter was doubtful, and George Bart clinched it by striding over to the depot where he found the agent just coming to work.
Henry, get me a message through to Sue. I need some things on the...
Hello, Mr. Bart,
said Henry with a dash of malice.
I hear you got a couple prisoners locked up in your storehouse.
Bart glared.
Get me a message through to Sue. They'll bring it on to 2 o'clock for me.
Mr. Bart, I sure hate to disappoint you, but there's a bridge out between here and there, and she ain't likely to be fixed up for weeks.
A washout? I didn't know the rain was that bad.
It wasn't. Just so happens that bridge seems to have blown out. Why, I ain't got the faintest notion. It'll be back come first part of next month.
Blown out? Look here, Henry. Wait a minute. When did that happen?
Seems like night before last. They was a feller in here yesterday to give me the word, and I sent it on through.
A lumberjant with brown eyes? A Texican?
Yep, reckon so. He's seen it on his ride in. Can't say where he come from, but there's no getting across the river without that bridge. Don't seem hardly important, though. There ain't no herds here yet, and we'll be able to ship 'em all when they do come. I sent word through to Sue, and that, not this, is the end of the line. Means a sort of vacation.
Bart had already left. He told the freighter angrily that he couldn't give any more supplies and watched the man drive away. He went back to the back of the New York bar and stood looking at the sod warehouse. Dutch was on guard.
Ain't stirred, Mr. Bart.
Go on over there and tell them to come out or we'll blow them out.
A shot made a neat hole just above Bart's head, and he hurriedly skittered back. It upset him. A splinter had nicked his ear, and he looked thoughtfully at the blood, swearing the while but subdued.
I'll find a way.
After breakfast, George felt better in that his breakfast always went down along with a mug of brandy and water. He was almost cheerful when he came into the store.
Let's have a keg of giant powder and a lot of fuse. It won't take much to blow in a wall.
The storekeeper stood fixed.
Well, where is it?
Aw, sold it.
Said Lem.
That freighter wanted 2 kegs, and all the rest is in the back end of the warehouse.
Bart whirled and bumped into Dutch.
Saddle up and ride after that freighter. Bring back a keg of giant powder and don't fail.
Dutch ran out, and Tolliver limped up, hand to his punctured ribs.
I think they're drunk in there, boss. I heard the dangdest yowls coming out of there. I thought somebody was mortal hurt until I hear the words of the streets of Laredo. They're drinking up the entire stock.
That would take a powerful lot of drinking. They ain't got long for it no ways. Dutch
was coming back, white-faced and racing.
Boss, the stable man is over there all tied up. And there ain't a single condemned hoss in the whole dang town.
They hurried to confirm it and found the Star barn entirely empty except for the stableman, who, gagged all night, wanted to cuss somebody good and proper and didn't care just who. Bart finally cut through the fanfare.
Who did it?
I didn't see good. A man in greasy buckskin and a beard, he come in and say he wanted to wash down his house. And then by my Jiminy's, the skunk whopped me. I come to in an empty stable, and not a one of you renters come near me the whole dang night.
Bart stared at the end of the sod warehouse he could see from here. The morning sun was bright. The meadowlarks were singing, and the prairie was steaming dry. But there was no loveliness in the view for him. He suddenly threw down his hat and jumped on it.
Cowpuncher lady dying. A cowpuncher lady dying. Cold as the clay.
It came faintly, but even at this distance, there were hiccups in it. As the days followed, freighters came and riders came. The food swiftly diminished in Thorpeville, and after the 5th day, not even a jackrabbit could be shot a decent walk from the place. As long as the river to the south remained swollen, no beef would come in, and very soon the 200 population of the community were notching up their belts tighter and taking speculative looks at one another. The effort to send a wire for help met with failure. There was too much water to the east, and no wagon could cross here for a while. Repairs were being made on the bridge, but this was also slow and difficult due to the floods. Then it began to rain again and made matters much worse. Half a dozen at a time began to walk out of Thorpeville down along the tracks, knowing they could raft or swim the break in the rails and maybe catch a handcar to Sioux 100 miles down the track. A telegram Henry got said that a train was there making repairs and would transport from there. It was only 60 miles. Why wait? The population began to walk. The constant guard of the sod house occasionally sought to surprise the alertness of its inmates. Various expedients were tried, such as shooting with rifles through the slots from long range, pushing burning boxes up against the doors, promises of money in return for parley, 2 outright charges, and 3 sneak attacks at night. All efforts failed. No matter how many songs came out of that warehouse to badger and irritate the guards, a foray was met with shots. George Bart was getting exactly no place. It had been going on for 2.5 weeks when George, one morning, found he had a population of exactly 15. 9 of these were too old to walk. 4 of them were his gunmen. 1 was his bartender, who was thought to have a secret store, he stayed so fat. And the remaining 1 was Bart himself. There was little food left. Somebody had shot a locoed horse out on the prairie, and they could live if they didn't object to horse meat. The prairie was drying again. The river to the south was reported down by an oldster who had gone out and shot himself a private deer. George Bart felt that if he could just hold on until a train could come through, he would bring up troops. Henry, the telegraph operator, had long since taken his own handcar down to the bridge and left it there as thoroughly as he had left his resignation of office on his desk. George Bart could not read the clicks and clacks of the instrument. He could only stand on the platform, listen at the window, and hope that the occasional sputters meant relief had already started. It was in this condition that Greg Matson and 4 Texicans found Thorpeville. They had forded with their cattle, and they held them now on the prairie about a mile from the loading pens, the first herd through of the season. They were promptly approached as they started to ride in, leaving 2 of their number to ride guard by George Bart.
I want to buy cattle.
Greg Matson had a beard now, and its stiff bristles hid him from recognition.
We got cattle. $30 a head, 2,000 head. Prime beef, all fed up to way south of the...
I don't want a herd. I want a dozen steers.
Greg sat his horse thoughtfully.
Now, ain't that unfortunate? I only selling 2,000 headlots today.
Bart kept his temper. He was hungry. He usually ate a lot.
All right. I'll buy the herd. Come on up to my office and I'll give you the fair price.
This looked like an easy victory. Greg and 2 men rode forward watchfully, keeping pace with the men on foot, and finally came to the New York house. The Texicans followed inside, very alert. George opened his safe and got out a stack of bills. He kept a lot of money on hand to buy up cattle buyers who had lost too much, and he brought out a thick sheaf of bills. Under the bills lay a derringer. His office window was very grimy and broken in one place, but he had eyes only for the Texicans before him. He started to swing, derringer cocked.
Look out!
Yelled sudden Johnny at the window. Bart tried to swing back and shoot. Dutch, diving for cover, upset him, and the derringer whammed into the safe door, both barrels. Johnny came through the window. A knife flashed, and Spanish Mike finished Dutch square in the doorway, blocking all exit. The noise in the room was loud and painful and long, and then from the din of smoke and swearing came sudden Johnny, dragging George Bart by the collar. They reached the street, and George pitched into the mud. Johnny let him get up and knocked him squarely down again. George rose a second time and went down a second time. He tottered to his feet a third and went suddenly backwards into a water trough where, except for the mercy of his opponent, he most certainly would have drowned. Sudden Johnny brought him back to the walk and dumped him down much like a man dumps a sack of spud potatoes. His 4 Texicans came out bringing what was left of Bart's crew. It was a very quiet town, a very quiet, deserted town. It is rumored that George Bart paid back $15,000 that day, as well as a poke of brass filings found in his possession. It is also rumored that George Bart sold his town, some say for $10,000, others for $8,000. The truth of the matter is, as Spanish Mike afterward told while deeply drunk, George presented the whole place to sudden Johnny when he saw the state of that warehouse. Presented it, and took the first train out for points unknown. The state of the warehouse, gloated Spanish Mike, was at once a wonderful and dreadful thing to see.